What we have in front of us this morning, Getting to the New Abnormal, is really a series title. And I hope to have 4 or 5 lessons in the weeks to come on this topic, looking at different elements of it. Because the cry around us today is, let's get back to normal. Let's get back to the way things used to be. And we hear that all around. In so many ways, I want to get back to the normal. I want to get rid of this uncomfortable things. You heard me apologize to my parents last night for believing all my life that a necktie was the most, especially during childhood, that a necktie was the most uncomfortable thing you could possibly wear to a worship service. And I've been proving to been wrong about that there are things much more uncomfortable than wearing a necktie. And so I want to get rid of these masks. Even more importantly, I want to get rid of the cause that's behind wearing these masks. And sometimes we can get so locked in to where we are and what's happening in our lives. I was talking to Louise just before services. I got an email, and that email, am I supposed to change? Really? In his mind, I just never do anything right. I appreciate he and Russ's hard work back there to do that. But I got an email this morning, and it was from a preacher in India. It's not Indiana, as in 30 miles away. It's India, as in a long ways away from here. And he asked me to email him and tell him, what situation was here. But he told me that they are in complete lockdown. Right? To the point that if you drive your car on the road, they confiscate your vehicle. Have been such since March 14th and have no hopes of being out of that quarantine until at least June 1st and maybe after that. He says that so many of the brethren there in India at his congregation are struggling to feed themselves on a daily basis. We can get locked into our own little world, right? What's happening right around me and what takes place right here. And we forget, or can forget, what takes place elsewhere. I want rid of this disease. I want to put it all behind us. And that way I want to get back to normal. But spiritually, I want to suggest that getting back to normal is not enough. It's not good enough. It's not even right. And throughout time, and we're studying about Jacob, we're studying about so many of these people in the Old Testament, they go through difficult times. In fact, God uses these difficult times. I used to think, when I read through the Bible, that the Old Testament time was just full of miracles. But if you read carefully and you study diligently, I believe that you will see that that's really not the case, that we have short periods of time that are written about where these amazing things happened. And these amazing things that are happening are always coming out of very difficult times. And that's when God is moving, and that's when God is performing the miracles that we read about in the Old Testament and even the New Testament. At the time Jesus Christ came into the world, God, for all intensive purposes, had been silent for 400 years. And then he moves in a big way. and difficult time. Let's not get back to normal. In some ways, we want to get back to normal. I want to get my hugs from Cheryl and from Emily and from so many more of you. And I want to be able to get rid of these things. But spiritually, I want to be better than what normal was. In Acts, the 2nd chapter, and we're going to read verses 14 through 21 to kind of set the context for the overall series before getting into this morning's specific message. And can you imagine the disciples, the apostles, in Acts, the 2nd chapter, saying, I want to get back to normal? And we have examples of people who wanted to just get back to normal. Remember Lot's wife? She wanted to get back to normal. She's looking back to the way things used to be. And she stands as a pillar of example. That was a pun. To remind us that sometimes getting back to normal is just not good enough. Remember in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, it's right around verse 15, after talking about all those great examples of faith, the Hebrew writer makes an amazing statement. He says, if they had desired to return to the country from which they had came, they would have had occasion to do so. But they desired a better country, a heavenly city, not made by hands, but by God. He's saying these great examples of faith didn't want to return to normal. They wanted to forge ahead. In Acts, the 2nd chapter, it's easy for us to overlook that this was a dire time. This was a gloomy time. We're going to read Peter's words in just a moment, but think about where Peter is at this time. Peter had given up his entire life. Remember, he said to the Lord at one point, oh, Lord, look what we've given up. We've given up our family, we've given up our livelihoods, we've given up our even our fishing. That's serious commitment. And Jesus responds, he says, there's not one that's giving up anything that's not going to receive tenfold. He's telling Peter, you're not getting the raw end of this deal. I promise you. But think about Peter. He's giving up 3 years of his life. He's dropped everything. And he's followed who he believes to be the Messiah. To see that Messiah crucified on the cross of Calvary, and probably to make it much worse, having denied him in his time of need. Three terrible days. Peter lamented and cried while our Lord and Savior was in the grave. But it didn't exactly get great after that, did it? Jesus keeps coming back, but he tells Mary Magdalene and John, don't cling to me. I've not went on to the Father yet. And that means probably a lot of things, but this one thing I think it can mean for us is Jesus was making it clear, I'm not here to stay. I'm back from the grave. I'm alive, but don't go to clinging on me because I'm not here to stay. I'm just passing through in some regards, a physical regard. And so these disciples are asking, in fact, in the first chapter of Acts, they ask and they say, Is this the time when you'll restore the kingdom? They're saying, is this when all the things I've been expecting are going to get back to normal? The kind of normal I was expecting, the kind of normal Jesus Christ that I was expecting when I followed you. When you would reign on your throne, make me one of the rulers, and all the world would bow down to me. That's the kind of normal I want to get back to. And Jesus keeps saying this. You talk about frustrating. Just wait. Wait in Jerusalem like I told you. I've told my children that. Wait there and be quiet. That's what Jesus is telling these disciples. And then in the second chapter, the Spirit falls, is poured out on these men. And from that moment forward, you never hear of one of the apostles, nor the disciples that follow, saying, let's get back to normal. They're going forward. They're moving upward. They're moving onward. Notice what takes place here. They are accused of being drunk. Acts 2 and verse 14. But Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them. Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and give ear to my words. For these people are not drunk, as you suppose, since it is only the third hour of the day. But this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel. And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and my female servants in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they will prophesy. And I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on earth below, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. You see, Peter is saying this is a time of prophecy. This is a time that we were promised. And so we're going to move forward. Well, how is it that we can benefit from moving to the new abnormal? I believe that there are some guiding principles that we must hold to, and that is the why. We must always start with the why. I'll end with this statement, but I'll introduce it now. The how, and this is not original with me, this statement, but I have found it to be true in so many ways. The how is temporary. The why is timeless. And that's a guiding principle. A number of us watched some seminars here a few weeks ago, and Simon Sinek, who wrote a book by this title, Start With Why. He's someone that I've watched a lot of and listened to a lot. And he was speaking on this context, and actually he was talking about in a religious sense, although he's not religious himself, as I know it. Amanda heard him talk about starting with why, and the fact that if we understand why, if we understand our motivating force, it will guide us through life. And man, to say, if I'd known that, my life would be so much easier. They said, what? I was kind of surprised. Because the why is so important. Notice what Jesus is getting at. And for so many years, this passage just really confused me. And I just didn't know what to do with it. And I'm not saying I completely understand it. But one of the things that I think I do understand about this passage that Kevin read for us this morning is that Jesus is emphasizing to the Pharisees that you've got so caught up in the how that you've forgotten the why. Starting in verse 23, one Sabbath day he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain, and the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, let me pause there for a minute, because we could go back into the Old Testament. This was not unlawful. But by the Talmud, the 26 volumes of books written by the Jews about what the law really meant and what it means in every individual circumstance and where the lines are in every situation, this violated their law. And Jesus could have told them, show me, go to Leviticus, open the book of Deuteronomy, go to Exodus chapter 20 and forward, and show me where this is wrong. But Jesus doesn't say any of those things. He brings out an interesting example. Have you never read, that must have surely been a slap to these individuals. Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. Jesus cites this example by David because they respected David so much. He says, haven't you read about how David did this? But 27 is so interesting. And then he says to them, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now that last statement is so important. Jesus is saying, I'm the Lord of all. And the Pharisees would have understood what he was saying and been upset about it. But notice what Jesus says first. The Sabbath was made for man. You see, the Pharisees and the religion of that day had completely lost the why. God made his law not just because it was right, but because it would save mankind. You say, well, hold on, Mike. You could go to the book of Hebrews and see that the law, or to the book of Romans and see that the law was never capable of saving us. That's why we need Jesus Christ. Oh, but that very law was our tutor that brought us to Jesus Christ. The purpose of the law was to help mankind. In particular, the Sabbath, which takes place way before the Mosaic Law, right? In Genesis, the 2nd chapter, we see the beginning of the Sabbath. We don't see the law until Exodus, the 20th chapter. The Sabbath starts way before then. God didn't need a rest. God instituted a day of rest at that time because you needed it. Because I needed it. Because man needed it. You see, it was to help mankind. The Pharisees had got so caught up with trying to figure out where every line was that they had turned it on its head, and the law itself had become a terrible weapon to slay mankind. Isn't that what Jesus is saying when he says to the Pharisees, you heap heavy loads on people's backs and will not use a finger to lift their loads. You've taken what was meant to be a blessing and made it a tremendous curse. Well, how would this apply to us? I think we had a difficult time, did we not? When we decided that we were not going to meet in a physical building. I did. I know some of you did. I know many of you did. Why? This is what church looks like. This is what church is. This is how we've always done it. And it's difficult sometimes to let go of what we've always known. I drive up the road here, and I haven't lived in that house on the left since 1998. Emily, that was a year or two ago. I'm not going to try and do the math, but that's home. Many regards. It's not my home today, but it's home. Connie shared a few weeks ago that after her father's house was crashed into, months later they tore the house down. It was difficult. Connie expressed that it was difficult for her. It certainly had to be difficult for your father. It meant something, right? Because that's where home is. It's the picture I have of it. But when we understand the why of our life, I think there's a guiding principle. Jackie shared her math a couple times on our chat. Matthew 18:20. When we look at what the New Testament Christians did in the days of Acts, particularly leading up to the sixth chapter, where these brethren were engaged in fellowship with one another, with prayer and the apostles' doctrine daily, we see that they understood a why. It wasn't about just coming to church. It was about the purpose of church. You see, I can come here and miss the whole point. I can come here, and I read C.S. Lewis, The Screw Tapes, a number of years ago, and in that book, he has a senior demon telling a young demon how to get his subject away from Christianity. He rebukes him for allowing him to get involved with Christianity. But he tells him this: well, listen, if you can't keep them away from church, get them thinking about the perfume and the person next to you, about the clothes or shoes that someone else is wearing. Get them to think about how that person doesn't sit right, how that person is not postured right in worship. And it won't be long until he won't be going. You see what the demon's saying? Let him go to church. Just make sure he doesn't remember why he's there. Get him thinking about everyone else's faults. Maybe even get him thinking about his own shortcomings. Get his mind off of why. This time has been difficult, but the why has been a guiding principle. It's been my guiding principle to try and make sure that every service I was here without you, that I was trying to do something to lift your spirit towards God, to draw you closer to Jesus Christ. The why is important. Now, I did this little video, and I asked Amanda and Christian to help me. Anna and Evie were away. I had to settle for Team B, the backup team. And by the end of the video, I understood why those two were so frustrated. My video on Facebook, I started telling Amanda, I'm going to make this video, and she was asking me why over and over again. And they were making it difficult for me to do this video. And finally, we get through to the end of the video, and just as I'm concluding the video. Christian's got this little scooter and he heaves it. And it lands in the back of the video. I was shocked. I said, Christian, what are you doing? Oh, he and Amanda rolled laughing. And then they left me. They wouldn't redo the video, so that's what I was stuck with. But I left it because it made me ask why. That's the first question I asked. Christian, why? Christian was the worst one about asking why. These conversations could last 45 minutes. We're going down Route 22 one day and looked across the sales place for trailers. He says, Dad, why are all those trailers there? He's about 3 years old. I said, because they sell them. Why? Because the salesman, Mike, needs to make a living. Why? Well, he has a family to feed. Why? Because he fell in love. Why? And, you know, this could just go on and on forever. What do we do? Just quit asking that. You know, we try and correct this out of our children, right? Because it's frustrating. But Jesus said in Matthew 18:2-4, that unless we become like little children, we shall in no ways inherit the kingdom of God. And I believe that one of the ways that that may be referring to, although this is not the primary context to what Jesus is saying, is that we remember the why. That we remember that Jesus died to save people. And that if I'm going to be concerned, if I'm going to be a follower of Jesus, I will be concerned with people. Here's this book I was telling you about, Start With Why, by Simon Sinek. And it's really what he's talking about, having this principle. The concepts are changing. He shared the other day that he gives public speeches to thousands of people right now. You think there's much of a market for that right now, Paul? No. You know what he's doing? He's going back to why. Why have I been doing what I'm doing? And he's renovating his entire business structure to keep hundreds of people employed. Who could guess? If you would raise your hand if you think you know when digital film was invented. Rough. Before or after the year 2000? Someone? Before. Before or after 90? Before. Before 70? Not quite, but close. That's why he... Now, how many of you in here were with Mike, is Kevin's? They kept backing us back. The reason I remember, it's the year I was born, 1979. Digital film was invented. Now, all of our youth are in Hawk Hall. They probably don't even know what this is, right? Did you know Kodak invented digital film in 1979? But they suppressed the technology because they were afraid that it would hurt the demand for film. And you know what? If we were to ask the children and the younger people that are in Hawk Hall today who Kodak is, most of them wouldn't be able to tell you who they were. Because Kodak is all but gone. They missed the why, and their business structure failed. That N over there, how many of you know what this is? A couple are squinting. Most heads are going up and down. I'm telling you what, this is the biggest necessity. We talk about essential businesses and workers right now during the quarantine. This N right here is the most essential thing that most people have in their lives. That's Netflix. Right? Their worth has skyrocketed, right? Tara, this may shock you. I've got to pick on you. You're the youngest we have up here. Do you remember when Netflix, you could subscribe for $4.99 a month and they would send you an actual DVD? I didn't think so. That's how Netflix started that I recall. They send you a DVD. You made a list and they sent them to you. If they'd have got caught on the how, they would be as bankrupt and gone as Blockbuster. Because all these video stores that we used to go to and rent movies from are gone. When I left Summerville, Cheryl, right up there in the plaza is still a video store. It's not there anymore. It's been long since gone. They had a why, and it kept them moving forward. They didn't get stuck on the how. They had a principle. How many of you, last example, would think you would recognize a South Korean company that was started in 1938 to trade noodles? Think you'd recognize that company? That was Samsung. Traded noodles in 1938. I wrote the founder's name down, but we're going to call him Lee because that's his first name. I've forgotten it, and I forgot where I wrote it down. 1938, he was trading noodles. He expanded to having a grocery store. If he'd got stuck on the how, you'd never heard about Samson. But after the Korean War, oh, where's Gary when you need him, Connie? I'm thinking 48. That's somewhere right, Korean War. 50, somewhere in there, okay? He decided that he was going to help South Korea become an industrialized country. And so he started engaging in any business that would help his country of South Korea impact the world. And you'd never associate Samsung with dried noodles or rice today because they didn't get stuck on the how. They had a clear why. Our why, brethren, is to take the gospel of Christ forward, to bring people close to God. Hebrews 13 and verse 8 says, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, the same today, and the same tomorrow. Sometimes we take that to mean that all change is bad. We should never change anything. We're going to emphasize by the end of this that there are things that should never change. But not all change is bad. And right now, brethren, we are in a time where we don't, I can't say we must change. We were changed. It happened for us. We're forced into it. What does that verse mean? Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. It doesn't mean that Jesus Christ dressed the same way we dress to go to worship. It doesn't mean that Jesus Christ sang the same exact songs that we sing in worship. It doesn't mean that Jesus Christ worshiped exactly how we worshiped. God's law has changed drastically throughout time. Think about what he told people to do. Genesis, the 2nd chapter, and really verse 17. I apologize for the most important verse being left out of that slide. He tells Adam there, don't eat of that tree of knowledge of good and evil. That was God's law. Pretty simple, right? Boy, we messed that up as people. Genesis, the 6th chapter, he tells Noah, build an ark. Now, why did God tell two people something very different to do? His why was always the same. Genesis, the 12th chapter. He tells Abraham, get up and leave your family. I'm going to take you to another country, to another land, excuse me. Genesis, the 50th chapter, in verse 26, there we see Joseph dying in Egypt. You see, he took Joseph into slavery. He took Joseph into jail. And then brought all the people, all of his family, some 70 souls, to that Egypt, that by the very next book, Exodus, the 3rd chapter and verse 2, all the people were enslaved. In Exodus 3 and 2, we see him calling Moses over to that burning bush. Very different details they told different people to do. Of course, we know that he uses Moses to deliver the people in the law. The 10 Commandments in particular are given in Exodus, the 20th chapter. And then the rest of the book of Exodus, for all intents and purposes, is the giving of the remainder of that law. At Mount Sinai, the Mosaic law is given by God, and God says, here's what you are to do. And then we have the prophets of the Old Testament that are calling people back to that law. They'd left God. They'd left His law. And so He's saying, come back to this Mosaic law. But then Jesus Christ comes and once again He changes what or the how God asked to be served. In Matthew 22, 37 through 40, there Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is. And I know that you know. That Jesus responds, you are to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And the second is like unto it, that you shall love thy neighbor, thy neighbor as thyself. You know, Jesus is not just making this up on the spot. He's quoting 2 Old Testament passages. You know what those 2 passages were? The why of all those laws. That's why he says, on these hang or depend the law and the prophets. These 2 points are the why. You see, that's why it's not so difficult to see Jesus in Matthew 5 and in verse 17. He says, don't think that I came to destroy the law. I came to fulfill it. And then what does he go on to say, Emily? But to say, you've heard it said that it's sinful to murder. I tell you, it's wrong to hate. You've heard it said that it is wrong to commit adultery. But I'm telling you, it's wrong to lust. And so he goes on, and what's he doing? He's saying this is the why. This is why God gave the law. You see, when it comes to a law, why do we hire attorneys? Why do big corporations hire attorneys? So they can find the loopholes, right? They can find how to benefit themselves as much as they can. If you are in trouble with the law, what do? You hire a defense attorney to help you. Find those loopholes. Find those areas to your benefit. Jesus is saying that's not so with the law of God, because it's the why. You see, Hebrews 13 and 8 in its context, the Hebrew writer was saying, don't get caught up in the things of this nation. Don't get caught up in the politics of today. Don't get caught up in your traditions and in your culture and in your nation, being the Hebrew nation of that time. And then he gives those great examples of people who weren't willing to go back to normal, but were ready to go on to the abnormal, to the new abnormal, to better. And he reminds them, Jesus Christ, the why, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What we've been doing for the last couple months is look different than what we were doing before. In many regards, it will look different going forward. But that why is and must be seen is timeless. Boy, Ford sure has changed a lot, haven't they? The how is temporary. But their guiding principle of providing transportation to the working class has remained the same. Our how is going to be temporary. But the why, brethren, is timeless. I have no greater purpose, I have no greater desire than to help you get to know Jesus Christ, to live a life as close as possible to that King, to that Lord, to that Savior. And brethren, I hope that's why you're here today. Not merely to live closer to God, but to help your fellow brothers and sisters to do the same and to spread that truth throughout all the communities and to all the individuals that we can contact with. This morning, if you have a spiritual need, if you're with us online, I encourage you to reach out through the chat, through the email, through any form, and make it known immediately. If you're with us here in person and you have a spiritual need, I encourage you, come forward and make that known as together we stand and sing.